Climb a tree.
Watch out.
Ah!
Hi there. Welcome to another episode of the Board Game Business Podcast. I'm your host, Richard New, and I'm here as always with Brian Hink and Jeremy Commander. Today we're going to be asking, how do I balance my game? Jeremy, is there a type of game that is the easiest to balance versus, games that are harder to balance? Like, just in general, what would you say is the easiest type of game to balance?
I'd say the party games are pretty easier to balance, as long as they're fun. They can be wacky, and they don't have to be very fair, because they're short, and they're wacky, and they're fun. Sure. And the kind of game that Brian does, the social deduction game, the social games, I feel are a little easier to balance, because the social dynamic of the people helps balance out the game. And if someone is winning, they get picked on more naturally, and there's more deal-making and things like that. And so I feel like those kinds of games are a little easier to balance than a straight Euro or economic or engine building game. Mm-hmm. Something like Dominion would be very difficult to balance, to make sure all the cards are costed appropriately for the effect they do.
Any tin that you grab can
they work together.
Game. Yeah.
And is there only one strategy that can win out of these 10, or is there multiple ways you could get to the victory? So those kinds of economic or engine building games, those are much more difficult to balance than a game that has more of a human component.
And I think, we shouldn't generalize too much. I think there's plenty of social games that do require a lot of balance. It's more about the components. And I think it's like the games that are party games happen to have, or not components, mechanics or mechanisms.
You do it to balance, can both teams win? So in Werewolf, can the werewolves win, given that they're a minority? And that's the balancing issue there. Or for New Salem, you worked a lot on getting the right amount of despair for the witches to win or lose. Right. That was the big balance issue there. Yeah. You're like, okay, how much despair cubes should there be for the witches to win versus lose? What is that number? And do I want to talk about any methods you use to arrive at that number?
Yeah, we did. A lot of it was playtesting and putting the data of playtests into a spreadsheet where we can see, how many despair cubes there were in a 3-player game, 4-player, 5, 6, 7, 8, and just game after game after game after game, and putting that in the spreadsheet.
Who won and who?
Yeah, yep. And then so we can see whether it's at the right level, especially as you go up from 3 to 8 players, because that's a lot, and the game changes with 3 to 8 players, so it's hard to get that balance just right.
I did a small Euro with Pass the Paint. And that is, a drafting game, but you're kind of building, it's a branching tech tree with your drafting, and you're kind of building a little economy of colors that you can build other colors. Mm-hmm. And for that, we made a tracking sheet that would record every card every player had at the end of the game, and then we put that all into a Google Docs spreadsheet, and then we put more than 100 games in there. We actually tested that game, I lost track, but more than 100 times. I think it's somewhere around 200 times. And then my design collaborator wrote a computer program that then analyzed the data from the spreadsheet to then adjust the point values and the costs on the cards to balance them.
I mean, you had the benefit of having a PhD helping you, figure that out. Not everybody has that on their team. Right. So how would you do that without having, someone that could actually write a program and
sure.
do all that data? Is it, if you can't find the formula, is it just a matter of, well, that's winning too much, let's adjust the number one down and see if that works? Because that also seems like, well, I guess I'll have to do 50 more playtests to see how it, balances out and see if that works.
Yeah, and I think there's a difference between whether a game is perfectly balanced, because sometimes you do have to do that. You have to just kind of watch people play and say, like, yeah, it's a 3, instead of a 4. We just got to bring this down a little bit. I can tell, just by all the games that I've been watching. But there is a difference between having a game perfectly balanced and having a game balanced as far as the players are concerned, like how the players feel about it. Because sometimes I've been able to math out how it should work, But for some reason, people don't like the boat strategy, and so now that throws off my balance. Nobody ever plays that, and so or they don't like it, or it's not as fun, so they don't do it. And so I need to give them a little more encouragement.
To it, something like that.
Yeah, it's more about. I mean, to me, it's a little more important about how people feel about it. So, like, can either of you guys think of in the Star Trek universe, there's a lot of
I know exactly what you're talking about.
So yeah, can you think of a time when it's balanced, but the players don't feel like it is?
We normally go towards the latter, which there's a whole costing in the game that I worked on. There's a costing structure, and there's whole spreadsheets that explain how things are supposed to be costed that I'm not privy to. So I'll write something and then send it off to someone else who looks it up, and those are very secret, like what exactly things cost.
It's like the Coke formula.
It is. So then those come back, and we send them out to playtesters, and we might get the data back over and over again, like, I like the idea, but I'm not willing to pay that for this thing. And so it just gets to the end. Sometimes you're like, well, nudge it down a little bit.
Yeah, there's something too with New Salem too, that we made it a little bit unbalanced towards the witches because we wanted that feeling of it's really hard for the witches. It's easier for the witches to win, and we wanted everybody to hate the witches. We wanted to put that in there where we give the witches a little bit of an advantage because we just want all the Puritans to get together and just really feel a hate for those witches because the game is a little bit easier for them, and you got to find those witches and put them on trial.
And so that social element is balancing it for you.
Was there a percentage then that you were looking for like when you're doing your despair things, and when you're saying like, oh, I'd like the witches to win 60% of the time or 70 or something like that? Or was it?
Yeah, I guess I don't know the exact percentage.
I mean, I don't want
to. We just do want the witches to win more on average.
Okay, all right.
Because there is a lot of social things you can do, I guess, to get it more in your favor too. Like you can really harass the players and say, like really grill them about being a witch if you really want to. And if people have that feeling of, man, I hate those witches, maybe they'll go that extra mile to work together to find them.
Jeremy, we've talked about this before, adding to a game and taking away from a game. If I'm trying to balance it, which way do you recommend? Or is it dependent on what you need to balance?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we all love our game. It's our baby and all the things we made for it. But the philosophy I would challenge people to have is, can I take this away? Because the simpler your game is, the more likely it is to resonate in the mass market. The more likely you are to sell more copies of it. So if you have, the boat strategy, and no one seems to be playing the boat strategy, and like, well, I could recost the boat strategy to try to get people to play that. Could you just drop the boat strategy?
Right,
people aren't using it. It clearly isn't needed in your game.
True.
Can you just cut it out and simplify your game? And so that might be a way to. I'll give you an example. So we're going to Booze Barons, and one of the challenges was how to end the game. And when you've got enough information to figure out who people are and what teams they are. And I had this movement system where you would chase people around to kind of chase them down and expose them. And that movement system had a great chase feeling to it, but it made the game too long. Because what happened is you got to this certain point in the game where you knew enough about the table, you could expose people, and then you had to chase them for 2 or 3 turns, which was just a chore before you could get them.
I remember.
And so I threw out the whole movement system. I blew it up, and I like that movement system. But I blew up that whole movement system up, and I went with a simultaneous one because it cut down the amount of turns it took to chase someone to get them. And in most cases, there's only 1 or 2 turns now to go. If you wanted to expose them, you could get to them within 1 or 2 rounds. You could get them.
I almost want to say that there's a counterpoint to that as well, the whole taking away thing.
Right.
There was a game we were playing, and I just forget the name because I frankly wasn't interested in it. There was like 5 colors in the game, and they all worked the exact same way. Every suit had the exact same cards in it, basically. And what made me so disinterested is that it was boring which one you decided to go with, which one you decided to try and build your deck around, that you were sort of deck building as it were. And then we found out there were extra cards that actually gave each one of them flavor, and even then I was just so like, it's just not enough. So I feel like there's something to be said for too much balance. The game that I'm working on right now
Mm-hmm.
has that. It's very well balanced. Everything, it's sort of a rock, paper, scissors, lizard, Spock type of situation. There's 5 type of things that you can do, and they all beat 2 of the others. But it's boring right now because there's really not a lot. You just sort of you put down your thing and sort of see what happens, and there's not a lot of choices to be made. There's not a lot of things forcing you. So it's one of those things where now that I feel like that's stable and it's balanced, but it's not interesting. And now I want to add something more to it to make it, why would I choose this over that? Why would I go in this direction? Why would I maybe pick a weaker card to go with just so that, it can possibly beat my opponent with a special ability type thing. So, there's something to be said for...
There's the theory of card players that TCG companies use. There's the Spike and the Johnny and the Timmy. Mm-hmm. And if people aren't familiar with this, you should Google it. This is very interesting to understand this theory.
This is from the Making Magic series.
Yeah, it's used other ways. And it's really a good way of thinking about it. So the Spike just wants to win. He'll do whatever strategy is going to win.
He has a good time in a tournament if he takes home the first place trophy.
Correct. And if everybody's playing red and he needs to play red to win, he doesn't care. Johnny wants to win, but he wants to win playing green. If everybody's playing red, it's not enough to win. I got to win and be different. I want to win, playing green if everybody else is playing red. Because I can't just win just like everybody else. That's boring.
And if he goes to a tournament and he wins one game against red with his green, he's happy.
Yes, that's very satisfying. And there's the Timmy player. And the Timmy player wants to do cool stuff. So if you think like Exodia and Yu-Gi-Oh! Or some giant hard card combos that's really hard to pull off. And maybe it's not that balanced. But when you get it off, it's like, I win! A lot of people really like that. And if you take that out of your game in the interest of balance, it takes too long or it's too hard, then the Timmy player is bored and doesn't like your game anymore. Mm-hmm. So there is that some things you may leave in that are imbalanced because they are fun.
Mm-hmm. There's so many things about game design that you need to take into account. Balance is one of them, but then there's also fun. There's also being able to market this game. There's so many other things that you need to take into account, components and how much they cost, that it's hard to get them all to come together. And I almost think you need to work on the other things first. And then go back to balance. Do you guys agree, or do you keep it balanced first and then add more things later?
With my game, I sort of had a plan of like some of the things that I wanted to have in there. Basically, starter cards for personalities that give you a different ability than every other player, that type of thing. Mm-hmm. That was something I wanted. I always like that when that's in a game, and I start asymmetrically to someone else.
Asymmetric start. Yep.
But I wanted the core of the game to be balanced first before I added that, so that as I'm testing it, I'm not having to guess, well, is it the game itself that isn't working, or is it the starting card? Like, I didn't want to have too many balls up in the air and not be able to tell which one's which.
Then you have to be... point. Yeah, you have to be careful too that like if you just add stuff, you can also add too much. You can add fiddliness, you can add complexity, and that's another thing that you have to worry about in game design too. There's so many things. What about you, Jeremy? Do you usually balance first and get a core to start with and build on top of it, or do you build a bigger thing and then balance it afterwards?
It depends on the game. So I've done different approaches for different games. Most of the time, I like to start with, I want to do this. And if something is having a balance issue, then I really will ask myself, do I have to have this? Mm-hmm. And can I cut it? Mm-hmm. And then I may start cutting it down in order to achieve balance.
And so you two have kind of described two different ways to look at it.
Yeah.
To start small and build, or start big and cut.
Right.
And so I think each designer kind of usually has one of those that they go with. Some will do a little bit of each, and some will. I go more with your strategy of starting small, and but we also build on like an experience too. We want to create that experience, and whatever we try to put everything in there to make that happen. And we usually don't do a whole lot of cutting. We don't do a whole lot of adding. It's just kind of just more merging and moving things around slightly,
I think a lot of designers are tempted to like, oh, this isn't that balanced. I'll just add an auction phase, and that'll balance that, right?
Right.
And you just keep adding stuff, and then your game has too many components, or the playtime is too long, and now it's hard to sell to a publisher, or it's hard to print it because it's gotten too big,
Or it's harder to play for newer players. which
harder
is
to play
a
for newer
huge
players.
thing as well.
Yep.
So Jeremy, if someone you're playtesting,
Yes.
and someone says you've had 4 people say that the king is too powerful,
Yes.
and then you've had 6 people say that the king is not powerful enough.
I had the advantage of working with a design partner. And so, again, if you're trying to balance your game and you can't do it on yourself, maybe it's time to work with someone else. And so the collaborator is very useful to kind of bounce it off and debate the pros and cons of different things. Or Grant, who did Hocus, the poker game.
Rodier.
He was working on Hocus for a long time. It was a fun game. It was fun to play. And he's having trouble balancing it. And then he got a lot of great feedback from a remote playtester. And he goes, you know what, I just want to bring you on as the co-designer on this game to help you balance it. And the guy's like, okay, I'm going to help you do that. And that made the game a lot better.
So
and you work with a partner too.
Oh yeah, always. I can design a game by myself, but I won't because it's not going to be as good as if I do it with someone else. So I'll always
That
design
separate
my part.
brain outside your head going, that doesn't make any sense. I don't understand. So maybe with the king, maybe I have to test it 100 times, look at my spreadsheet, and go, okay, won this percentage, that's the percentage I want. Even though some people are going to hate it, I'm going to leave it in because the win percentage for what it's doing is where I want it to be.
Yeah. And I'll be honest, when you asked that question, my first thought was, I mean, besides getting into more detailed information, I'd want, like, well, did you dislike it because you lost against it? Or, like, that's
Right.
always a possibility.
Yeah.
That if someone's saying it's too good and someone's saying it's too bad, it's probably about right.
Yeah.
Like, that's my first thought. It's like, oh, it sounds good to me.
But I may want to track it and see, what is this win percentage?
Don't ignore it, but...
Yeah.
And it gives people a reason to complain afterwards, which you don't want. I mean, if there is something that polarizes people in that way, you don't usually want that because people are going to go on BGG and complain about how it's overpowered or underpowered. Or, you don't really want that.
I think there's a big difference between balancing the middle of a game versus balancing the end of the game, too. Have you ever had what you felt was like a very balanced game throughout the entire thing, and all of a sudden you get to the end and it either ends, and slams a score in one direction, or just sort of fizzles out or something like that, and you're like, that's just that doesn't work. How do you balance the end of a game?
So there's a couple of ways to do it. I think one of the ways I like to do it is by playtime. And so, like, how long do I want this game to play? And how long is it still fun? So if this game is only fun for 20 minutes, then I need the game to end at 20 minutes. How do I make it end at 20 minutes? Even if I had this other thing I had planned on with the last 5 minutes or 10 minutes or that isn't as much fun, then I need to make the game end at 20 minutes. And so the game ends when it's still fun. For some people, they may make the game too short, but I'd rather have it too short than too long.
So you added some location abilities in Booze Barons to make it easier to tail somebody,
And
even if you're not at their location.
And threw in a movement system and did a shorter movement system to do that. Yep. For Pass the Paint, people often say, the game is too short. I really wish it would have a third round.
I thought that myself.
I wish it was longer. And so we tried testing a third round, and the third round just wasn't as much fun as the first 2 rounds. It wasn't, one of them we tested was horrible. Another one we tested wasn't so bad, but it was just kind of mediocre. And that's kind of like getting a mediocre sequel.
And if that can be the best part of the game, then now if it's short enough, you can just play again.
Play again.
You get the best part, and you get it twice. But if you have something like Power Grid, I'll play Power Grid, but there's absolutely no way I will ever play 2 games of Power Grid in a row.
Right.
There's no way. There's no way it would happen. And I don't think I'm alone in that. So how do you keep it balanced? So, how do you keep the end game balanced when you're lengthening it and shortening it?
Almost never lengthen it. It's almost always about shortening it.
Okay.
And so let's say that if I want to shorten something, I'm like, well, how can I accelerate this? So in the case of Booze Barons, I could change the delivery cards so they give away more information. So now, instead of letting you collect more and hide yourself, I've rigged them so that you have to give yourself away after so many cards. And that will shorten the game. I can do something like a mechanic where you can get to people at the end automatically through a location ability and not have to chase them around.
So easier to reach that end game.
Easier to reach it, yeah.
Sure.
So what can I do to accelerate? Or maybe I just want to lower the in-game goal. Maybe I was asking people to play to 10 points, But the game is really only fun when you play to 7 points. And the last 3 points are kind of a formality, and you know who's won. So maybe I just change the game that you play to 7 points, and the game is over.
So basically, I mean, whatever you're doing, everybody should be working towards the goal, increasing their score as they go, and keeping that pretty well balanced throughout the game, rather than having swings is probably the best way to do it, to keep the end game balanced. And if you have any swings, have it in maybe that final scoring. Do you think that's true, where, that's where you'd say, oh, I get 20 points because I, built my castle?
I do like the hidden scoring. Nothing is worse than playing a long game like Power Grid and you know you've lost and you still have a half hour to go.
Yep.
That is a horrible, horrible feeling.
It is.
So hidden scoring or in-game bonuses or goals are nice because then you don't really know for sure who has won. And that is nice to do. Or if you have a catch-up mechanic, that can help your game reach the right ending because now that people have a way to catch up if they do fall behind. So most of my games, I'm trying to think of how do I have a catch-up mechanic so that we keep the game close all the way to the end and no one feels like they're out.
And always having a way to win no matter where you are in position. If you're in lowest position, at least have something out there that you're saying, if you can get here, if you can do this, if you can shoot the moon, you can win. You can still win. It might be harder because you're behind now, but you can do it.
And people will tell you that's not balanced. Like, oh, it's not balanced, you shoot the moon. Well, it's really hard to shoot the moon. And if my tracker tells me it only happens 1 in 10 games, then I'm going to keep it.
Well, thank you guys for discussing that with me and discussing it with our viewers. I've been your host, Richard New, and I'm here as always with Jeremy Commander and Brian Hink. And I'll see you across the table someday.
Hey, this is Richard to remind you that you can check out our website at boardgame.business. Old episodes are indexed by subject to make finding an answer to your question easier. You can find links to our BGG Guild, other networking sites, and, if you feel like supporting us, our Patreon account. Donations are used for equipment to improve the presentation of our podcast. Thanks for watching or listening.
Thanks so much for watching the Dice Tower videos. Find more great videos and reviews as well as our top-rated audio podcast at Dicetower.com. You can also find other great shows at Dicetowernetwork.com. I'm Eric Summerer, and you've been watching The Dice Tower. The Dice Tower is sponsored by Cool Stuff Inc., where you can find great games for great prices. Cool stuff in stock. Check them out at CoolStuffInc.com.